Welcome to Marin Poets Live. I'm Neshama Franklin. I work at the Fairfax Library and I love poetry. So it's a special pleasure for me to share this opportunity to introduce you to poets from our county in the flesh, as it were, as they read and discuss their work. The funding for this project came about when Kay Ryan, twice U.S. Poet Laureate, agreed to do a benefit for the Marin County Free Library. With the proceeds, this project was launched in partnership with the Marin Poetry Center. Monthly tapings will be broadcast on Marin TV and then become part of a special page on our website, along with biographies of the poets and links to our collection. A common thread throughout each month's program will be discovering how living in Marin has influenced their poetry. There's nothing like the experience of hearing a poem straight from the poet's mouth and heart. The rhythms, the inflections, the presentation all feed the material in a way that enhances our perception and understanding of the work. After all, the first poems were all in the oral tradition. I grew up hearing the voices of poets on Cadman records, oh, the seductive boom of Dylan Thomas, and went on to poetry readings in the 70s that were as popular as rock concerts. Yes, the poem on the page is a more familiar form of intimate, thoughtful transmission between poet and reader, but in person, as you'll discover here, poetry out loud can sing. For our first program, Jackie Kudler of the Marin Poetry Center will give us some background and share her poetry. Hi, Jackie.
Hi.
Well, what I wanted first, before we talk, is a poem, and a poem that sets us right in the heart of Marin County.
Yes, well, what could be more in the heart of Marin County than Mount Tam? And for anybody who likes the wildflowers on Mount Tam, this poem. After the long, bitter season. Each day in April they are here again, high on the open slopes, under the pine, beside the suddenly garrulous streams, pushing up from last summer's cemeteries, the iris, the lupin, the baby blue eyes. And we are waiting for each new appearance, each new signal of redemption, the earth returning to us again after the long, bitter season. I want to talk about the calypso orchids here this Wednesday all at once. 2 days of the sun's touch, just enough to coax them out from the cold. Winged pink petals on leafless stems, they grow where least expected, the ground rocky, inhospitable, shrouded with sparse dead pine shards. Each year we think to find them in a kinder context, the new tender grasses of a meadow perhaps, but no, this is the soil, the shade, the hardship that sustains them. I want to sit down on this stony hilltop in the middle of this bitter year, watch how the orchids launch their pink parachutes out between one darkness and another.
Oh, that's just perfect.
Thank
It
you.
It is the poem rising from the stony soil.
Yes.
That's what it's all about.
Right.
So let's talk about community, because you represent a community of poets. I didn't realize there was such a thing. How did this poetry center come about?
Well, I think it came about historically in the early 80s, and a group of poets that included Kay Ryan, our esteemed U.S. Poet Laureate, and Jane Hirschfield, and Cole Swenson, among others. The idea of bringing a community together to bring poetry out. I think the mission is to promote the cause of poetry in Marin County. I got involved in the early 90s and spent 10 years on the board doing various things. We give readings, workshops. It's a community of poets. And for me, poetry is a very solitary act, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And it's such an amazing thing to join in a community of people who are doing the same thing and who love listening to poetry. So there are readings every month for people who love poetry and don't write it. And it's a wonderful group. There are people scribbling poems all over Marin County.
There's a lot of poetic energy
Yes.
here. So how did you start writing poetry? Why poetry?
Oh, I was one of those little girls who wrote poems and memorized poems. We all had to memorize them.
By heart.
By heart, and hated it, but the rhythms are still in my head. And I love to write, and I love to write stories and poems all the way through school. I stopped writing when I started majoring in English literature. I was reading Donne and Milton and Keats and T.S. Eliot, and I started to feel like, well, if that's what poetry is, what am I writing? And for a number of years stopped. I came into it quite by accident when I had 2 children. I was in my 30s here in Marin County, and I was teaching kids and interested in writing technique, teaching writing. A gentleman named Lawrence Hart, who lived up in San Rafael, was teaching a class for teachers on teaching writing. And I couldn't get into that class, asked him to keep me on his mailing list, which he did. And when I could get into a class, I was there for a half an hour before I realized it wasn't a teacher writing class, it was a creative writing class. He had just forgotten what it was I wanted. It was the 70s, and you know, God moves in mysterious ways, go with the flow and all that.
And there are no accidents.
And there are no accidents. I thought maybe this is a good idea. At some point, he called me up to the desk in a very serious way, said, you should be writing poetry, and are you interested in coming to a workshop? That workshop is still being conducted by his son, John Hart, here in Marin County, a very, very wonderful poet and a good teacher.
Beautiful to hear. I think we should take this time to just rest into your poetry. Give us, as Robert Bly would say, give us some poems.
Great. Another Marin poem from my first book, and quite the opposite. There were clouds in the sky today, and I thought, weather report says rain on Monday or Tuesday, so maybe I'll read a very rainy poem, and this is a really rainy poem about a 4-day power outage in Sausalito. Once you've seen mud move, whole hillsides shimmy, slip seaward. Once you've heard earth give, settle, make its own small corrections, you know how tenuous any toehold here can be. Once you've seen love fall away, vanish in a bandaged word, a clattering silence, you lose all disposition toward long views. Hold tight to the near at hand. All day long, while rain-lapped posts below our floorboards toppled power poles above, I simmered Taki's chicken soup over a low gas flame. Tonight, together, we sit down by candlelight to sip the hot of it from steaming bowls, along with crusty bread, arugula, and good Greek wine. So somebody said there's never been arugula in a poem before. I want to go to my new book, Easing into Dark, and a poem that from which the title came, about looking into other people's houses at night, something I very shamefully enjoy doing, and wrote this poem about, discovered a lot of people feel the same. The Room. Maybe it's an evening in late November, the sky just easing into dark, the first star a smudge above the rooftops, and you're heading out to a movie or a talk, the engine idling, idling at a long light, long enough for you to look into the room. Suspended just above the street, a miniature world lit up like one of those glass globes you shake to make snow or stardust. No snow in this world, though, not here on Sacramento Street. A living room, high-ceilinged, glow of a rose lamp at the window, piano, paintings, something Diebenkorny above the couch. And you know, of course, that something simmering on the stove inside, something slow, a cassoulet, infusion of garlic, thyme, Pinot Noir rising through layers of calm and certainty. Everything you need is here. Music, yes. Note by note, a Bach adagio unspooling, the evening poised on plucked strings. This is the room you've never entered, the life you've never lived, untouched by trouble, untouched by time, offering itself up to you so gladly at last. The least you can do is roll down all the windows for as long as your luck hangs in, as long as the light holds.
That's just wonderful. And it just makes me so happy to be in this project because I'm hearing the music of the words and I'm hearing the vernacular and they're playing with each other all the time. Go ahead, but I just wanted to tell you that.
All right. The center of the book are poems that I wrote in the year after my husband's death in December of 2006. So in the first few months, all the machines in my house broke down. This poem is called The Machines. First, the grill ignition failed. Then, not 10 days later and 2 months after you died, the fridge condenser went, but slowly. For days, I watched the glacier crawling down along the back wall. It wasn't much longer before the timers in the double oven and the upright freezer quit, as if some universal clock had simply stopped somewhere, all dials fixed at midnight. By his fourth call, the national appliance guy opined he'd never witnessed such a run of luck. Everything breaking down like that around me. He hoped, with eyes accustomed to assessing hairline cracks and fissures, that I was holding up okay. I told him how my days, amazingly enough, go well. I wake, bathe, lunch with friends, call the kids, and at night, when I sit down at the table, I light a candle at your place. Oh, I'm doing well enough, I said. But given their histories, the nature of their finely wired dispositions, I wouldn't presume to speak for the machines. And we dedicated a bench for Joel on the Sausalito waterfront, and I get to walk by it all the time. The bench. Coming and going, I pass your bench along that open sweep of seafront, strolling the promenade above, the riprap wall, or running, as I've begun to do again, the way we did together. And going and coming, I stop to visit a bit, if only to trace your name with my fingertips, as I run by, as I did this March morning, a few clouds shadow-rimmed, still heavy with December memories, floating overhead in the great blue spaces of sky. A new sloop anchored just offshore, its crew hosing down the decks, gulls lifting, dipping to their morning manna from the galley. A soft day, as we like to say, as I said again this morning, running past, then turning to circle back at the old Valhalla, when I saw them, the lovers, not sitting, no, but standing on the bench in full embrace, his arms cradling just below her shoulder blades, her arms lifted, locked behind his neck, both bodies arched, leaning each into the other, as if whatever remaining space between might drift away along with the last few flurries of fog on the water. Young? No, not entirely. Something about the substance, the certainty of their purchase on the world, suggested rather they were just en route toward middle age. A hidden tryst? A night off from the kids, perhaps? Or maybe just a night away from the new narrowing of their lives. No matter. They are my hello to you this morning. Where better for them to still the rushing currents of their moment than here on this bench where the end and the beginning of the seasons meet.
That's a beauty. I mean, they're all beauties. The coming, the going, the new sloop. I'm just gobbling up these words.
Yeah.
I want more poems, but there's stuff for us to talk about.
Yes.
So this is such good stuff. Why don't people read poetry? Why do few people read poetry? You have some ideas, I bet.
Well, I think largely because somewhere in the 20th century, poetry took a very difficult turn into modernism, you know, along with music and art, people staring at abstract expressionists and saying, what is this? Of course, that's later in the 50s, but it all started with Cubism. And so poetry became a little bit more difficult to read, dropped its rhymes, which made it easier to read. And depending on the kind of poetry you're writing, sometimes it takes a while to get. I'm thinking of a line from William Carlos Williams. It is difficult to get the news from poems, but men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. So it is difficult sometimes to get the news, but there are many poets that are highly accessible. I think my poems are mostly fairly accessible to understanding, and as such, people tend to turn to poetry for the great occasions of their life, weddings, funerals, all manner of occasions.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Now you've talked, you've mentioned some poets, but what do you have, ones you'd say these poets have influenced me heavily?
Oh, my. You know, Emily Dickinson, who's way out there, I started reading her when I was a kid. We all memorized some of those apparently easy poems.
Right,
and so she has been a great love. Now, in her sort of leaps of metaphor and the compression, which I never quite get, but I admire tremendously in poetry, probably more than anything else, those two. The very strange use of metaphor and the tightness. Now, good poetry has to be tight, so each word has to do the work of 10. But then, of course, I was schooled in the great modernists, the poetry of Eliot and Yeats. And then some of the poets that came in the 70s, and I'm thinking of the early Sharon Olds in particular, who is still very much writing these days, was writing from a female point of view about specifically female experience, none of which had ever been written about.
Domestic stuff.
Domestic stuff. See, Emily Dickinson got a little of that, but not really. But Sharon Olds was writing about sex, childbirth. She has a poem about a miscarriage that I read not long after I'd had a miscarriage. So the business, and many of the poets who came in there at that time, Louise Glück is a favorite poet of mine. I love her work. Philip Levine, his voice. And, well, I love them all.
Yes, definitely. So these books are published by...
Oh, these two were brought out by 16 Rivers Press sometime in 1999. I got a letter asking me if I was interested in becoming a member of a collective press. And it was a group of people who had known each other through the poetry community and who had decided to take publishing into their own hands. Very difficult to get poetry published. And I said yes. And the way it works is that once there's a selection process, and once your book is selected for publication, you are signed up for 3 years of servitude to the press. So the thing about 16 Rivers Press is the poets who write the poems are the press. We do all of it outside of sending it out to be printed and book designed, although some of the people have designed their own books. Each year we try to bring 2 new poets in. So an organization that started all those years ago is still going very, very strong. And is very vibrant and wondrous.
So you get to be midwives for
Midwives,
each other's books.
Yes. The proceeds from my book go to produce next year's books. Nobody makes any money. No. And you work. But you get to produce great poetry. And the other dividend, of course, is you get to meet the nicest people.
Right.
Each year, new people coming in.
Yes. So that's a beautiful connection all the way around. The whole thing is that you represent is connection and poetry, which is so hard because poets are doing very private work.
We are doing very private work, and it's the thing I least expect. And I think I've said to you once, I'm a fairly purposeful person, but poetry is something that has simply come into my life in all of these strange ways. A letter arrives, or in the case of Lawrence Hart's class, when I started writing, I wasn't supposed to be in that class. Marin Poetry Center, somebody calls me and asks me if I want to be on the board, and I say sure, and then the next 10 years of my life are completely consumed with this enterprise. So poetry, and then the writing of poetry. Of course, anybody who says they write a poem isn't paying attention.
You want to share a little bit of that process with us? Where do you begin? Can you do that?
Well, the poem writes you, or at least that is my experience. If there is such a thing as a muse, it has its own way. And for me, people write in different ways and have their own processes. Often begins with a strong feeling about something, and often begins in an image of something, a visual or tactile, something that has a reality. What seems to link up with that emotion. Eliot called it the objective correlative. The object that will elicit that emotion, hopefully, in your reader. But at any rate, it begins that way for me. I know poets who write every day for a specific length of time. Yes, most poets do that, but it's different for me. If I sit down at a desk, nothing's going to happen, nothing. So I carry the poem in my head and I hear it before I write it down. Therefore, I might not be a very good lunch conversationalist because something will hit me. And the worst or the best time for me is when I'm out walking alone, walking on town, or driving, which I'm ashamed to admit. Sometimes I've missed my exit, but I start to get 2 or 3 lines in my head, and